The morning Thomas Aldrich found the chief, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind was coming off the mesa in long, cold pulls. He had been surveying fence lines on the Cedro Creek land since first light, moving northeast along the boundary markers, with his notebook and his coat buttoned to the collar, the grass stiff with early frost under his boots. The work was ordinary. He had done it a dozen times on this stretch. He was not expecting anything. He almost walked past him. The man was down in a shallow draw, partially obscured by the dry brush along the creek bank, and at first glance Thomas took him for a pile of gear or a downed branch. Then he saw the hand. The fingers were open, palm up, in the way of a person who has stopped deciding things. He went down into the draw. The man was alive, barely, in the way that barely means you would not bet on it. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with the quality in his face of someone accustomed to being looked at directly and looked at back. He was wearing a blanket coat that had been good once. There was a wound along his side that had been tended, wrapped with a strip of cloth, now stiff and dark, but the tending had been a day ago at least. His breathing was shallow and irregular, each breath arriving with a pause after it, as though the next one had not yet decided to come. His eyes were closed. Thomas looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he already knows the answer to. The nearest shelter was the Delgado Line cabin, 9 miles back west. There was nothing closer worth the name. His horse had thrown a shoe 2 miles back, and he had left it tied at the creek bend. The horse was not carrying anyone anywhere until the shoe was seen to. The temperature was dropping. The draw offered no real protection from the wind, only a slight depression in the ground that changed the direction of it. He crouched down and got his arms under the man and stood up. He was not a small man himself. Still, the first quarter mile was instructive about the difference between lifting and carrying. He walked. The wind came down off the mesa without apology. The scrub thinned and gave way to open ground, and the full weight of it hit him across the shoulders and chest. He kept his head down and found a rhythm, not fast, not slow, the pace of a man who understands that 9 miles is not a sprint and not a walk, but something in between that requires a particular kind of stubbornness to maintain. The frozen grass crackled under his boots. His breath came in short bursts that the cold took immediately. The man across his shoulders was breathing. Thomas counted the breaths for a while. The way you count something when you need to keep your attention on one specific thing and off everything else. He counted to 20 and started again. The breathing was still shallow, still irregular, but it was there. A mile out, he stopped and rested for 3 minutes against a juniper that was large enough to lean on. He did not set the man down. He stood there with the weight still across him and looked at the horizon and the pale line of the creek threading through the scrub and the long gray sky above it all. Then he pushed off from the trunk and started again. 2 miles out he heard voices. 2 men, Navajo, coming up from the creek at a distance. He called them. They came on a run. One of them made a sound when he saw the man Thomas was carrying, a sound that was not loud but contained a great deal. The other had his hands out before he had fully stopped. Thomas let them take some of the weight, but not all of it. There were 2 of them, and they were in better condition than they should have been for men who had been out in that cold, and he understood, without being told, that they had been searching. They walked the remaining 7 miles between the 3 of them. The Delgado cabin was empty and cold, but it was a shelter, and it had a stove that still drew. Thomas built the fire, while the 2 men settled the chief on the bunk with the careful efficiency of people who know what they are doing. One of them looked at Thomas with the quality of attention that does not require a shared language. Thomas nodded and went back out to see about water. He came back for his horse in the afternoon. He repaired the shoe at the Delgado forge and rode back to the cabin as the light was going and stayed the night on the floor by the stove to be sure the fire held. The temperature outside dropped through the floor of the night. He fed the fire every 2 hours. In the morning, the chief's eyes were open. He looked at Thomas across the cabin with the direct, undecorated attention of a man who has been told he was nearly dead and is deciding what to do with the information. His color was better. The difficult sound had gone out of his breathing. Thomas said, "You're looking better." The chief said nothing, but something in the set of his face shifted. A small acknowledgement, exact and sufficient. Thomas rode back to his farm. He did not mention it to anyone in Harlan Creek. The town found out anyway, in the way towns find out things, by accretion, by piecing together small details until the shape of a story emerges, whether or not its subject intends it. The two men from the creek had been seen near the Delgado Road. The cabin had been used. Someone's cousin had been on that stretch of land. Within a week, the broad shape of it was known, and within 2 weeks, the interpretations had calcified into positions that had less to do with what had happened and more to do with what people had already decided about Thomas Aldrich. He went on with the farm. 3 weeks after the morning in the draw, he came out of the barn at first light and stopped. There were horses along the fence line, a great number of them, standing in the gray morning without sound, their breath coming in small clouds in the cold air. He stood in the barn door and counted until he stopped counting, somewhere past 400. The chief was at the fence on a gray horse, upright and still. Thomas crossed the yard. He walked to the fence and stopped. The chief looked at him with the same direct, undecorated quality as the morning in the cabin, and something passed between them. The particular understanding of two people who have been in a difficult place together and come out the other side of it. Thomas nodded. The chief nodded. His people turned their horses without sound and rode. Thomas stood at the fence until the last of them had gone over the rise. Then he went in and made coffee and started on the day's work, because the fence line on the south pasture still needed attention and the season was not waiting. He did not mention this to anyone in Harlan Creek either. The town mentioned it for him. It was after the Warriors Road that the talk acquired its current shape and sharpness. 400 armed men at a homestead fence was not something Harlan Creek could metabolize quietly. The town sorted itself into those who saw it as evidence of something admirable and those who saw it as evidence of something dangerous, and the sorting happened fast and was not kind to Thomas, because the people who sorted loudest were the ones who had already been looking for a reason. He went on with the farm. He wrote an advertisement for a housekeeper in March. He mailed it to 3 territories. The 8:30 coach arrived on a Tuesday, and Clara Voss was the last one off. She came down the steps with her bag held against her side and her chin at the level of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart. The dress she wore had been pressed before the journey. It had not survived it. The hem was gray with trail dust, and the collar had gone soft in the heat, but she wore it as though it had not. She stood on the boardwalk outside the stage office and looked at the street with the careful attention of someone matching the reality to their preparation. The street did not match the letter. The town was smaller. 1 general store, a livery, a land office with a warped door, a church without a steeple, a water trough near the center of the road with a dog sleeping under it. 3 men sitting on an upturned crate outside the barber's, watching her with the quality of attention they would not admit to if asked. She did not look at them. She opened the envelope she carried in her coat pocket and read the address inside, which she had already memorized but read again anyway, the way a person holds a map even when they know the road. The land office was the place to start. The man behind the counter had a beard the color of weathered rope and spectacles pushed up on his forehead he did not appear to use for reading. He told her the farm was 4 miles northeast, first turning after the creek crossing. He said there was talk in town about Thomas Aldrich, that she would hear it soon regardless, and it was better plain than dressed up. She said, "Tell me." He told her. He was brief. She said, "Thank you." She picked up her bag and went back out into the street. The 3 men in the crate were still there. She walked north without looking at them and let the town fall behind her. The road northeast ran between stands of juniper and scrub oak. the ground still carrying some spring softness underfoot. The afternoon light was low, and the grass along the road edge was the color of old straw, except in the low places where it had gotten water and gone green. She walked the 4 miles without stopping. Her bag was not light. She did not set it down. She heard the farm before she saw it, a hammer coming down behind the tree line, steady and unhurried, the sound of someone working through a task rather than toward a deadline. When the property opened up, she stood at the fence line and looked. It was a working farm, not prosperous but tended. A house of good timber, a barn in better condition than the house, a kitchen garden along the south wall. Firewood stacked with the cut faces out. A water barrel under the rain channel with the lid fitted properly. She went through the gate and around to the barn and found him there, a man of about 40, broad through the shoulders, repairing a fence post that had rotted at the base. He had not heard her come up. She said, "Mr. Aldrich." He turned. He was a plain-faced man, not handsome and not handsome, the kind of face shaped by weather and work and arrived at something simply itself. He had dark eyes he used carefully, in the way of a man who has learned to watch before speaking. He said, "Miss Voss." Not a question. He said, "You walked from town." She said, "It was 4 miles." Something crossed his face she did not try to read. He set the tamping iron against the post and picked up his coat from the fence rail and put it on, which was a form of respect she noted without acknowledging. He said, "I'll show you the house." The house had 2 floors, 4 rooms below and 2 above, and was cleaner than she had expected. Not spotless. Dishes stacked at an angle that would have taken her 30 seconds to correct. The floor near the stove swept, but not recently. But there was order in it. The order of a man who had made rules for himself and held to them imperfectly. A kettle on the stove, 2 cups on a shelf, a child's drawing fixed to the wall above the table with a nail, the paper gone yellow at the corners. He showed her the room off the kitchen, with a window that looked east. A bed, a chest, a peg for coats. She set her bag on the bed and stood at the window. He said from the doorway, "The children are at the Hennessy place down the road. They'll be back before dark." She said, "How old?" He said, "Nora is 6, James is 9. She said, "And they know I'm coming." He said, "James knows what it means. Nora mostly knows there will be someone in the kitchen." She said, "That's enough to start with." He nodded and left her to it. She unpacked. There was not much. A change of clothes, a household account book she kept herself, a tin that had once held tea and now held the things she did not speak about, a letter, a ring not on her hand, a photograph of a woman who had been her mother. She put the tin in the chest without opening it. She hung her coat. She went to the window and looked at the light on the juniper along the east line until she heard horses on the road. She went out to meet the children. Nora came through the gate at a run and stopped and looked at Clara with the direct, unfiltered attention of a 6-year-old who has not learned to pretend she isn't looking. She said, "You're very tall." Clara said, "You're very small. We'll balance each other out." Nora considered this and accepted it with the gravity of a child receiving a reasonable offer. She took Clara's hand, which had not been extended but was accepted as the logical place for a small hand to go. James came through the gate a pace behind, with a look of careful neutrality fitted over something more frightened. He was a child who had dressed himself that morning without being told and stood very straight. He said, "You're the housekeeper." She said, "I am." He said, "That's what you're here for." She said, "That's what I'm here for." He went inside without further comment. She went in after him and started supper. The first 2 weeks were a process of calibration. She learned the house at different hours, where the cold air came in, which hinges needed oil, which floorboards would wake a child at night. She learned that James ate without complaint, but ate less when something differed from his mother's version, and that Nora ate without noticing most things, except whether there was something sweet after. She learned that Thomas Aldrich took his coffee without anything in it, left early, came in late, and said thank you every time in a plain voice, in the way of a man who had not forgotten that politeness was a choice. She fixed the hinges. She restacked the dishes. She refitted the lid on the flour barrel that had swollen and jammed at an angle. 20 minutes and a chisel. Work Thomas watched from the doorway for a moment before going back out without comment. She began keeping the farm accounts without being asked, moving the figures Thomas had been keeping on loose paper into a proper bound book, organized by month and category, in a hand that was neat and fast. She left it on the table one evening open to the grain page with a figure corrected. He looked at it when he sat down for supper and said nothing. The next morning the loose papers were gone from the shelf above the stove. That was the whole transaction. She noticed around the third week that he had begun leaving the barn door unlatched on the mornings she had early kitchen work. A small adjustment that meant she did not have to cross the yard in the cold to ask about the milk. He had not mentioned doing it. She had not mentioned noticing it. This was more or less how things moved between them, by adjustment rather than announcement, by the small, steady grammar of shared work. James tested her twice more in those early weeks. The first time he simply refused the afternoon task she had set, sitting at the table with his arms crossed. She sat down across from him and picked up the paring knife and started on the potatoes herself. He watched. Then he picked up a potato and started in. She said nothing. The second test was worse. He said something at supper aimed at making her feel unwelcome. She did not keep the words, only the shape of them, the way a child cuts when frightened and does not know what to do with the fear. She looked at him steadily. She said, "Finish your supper." He did. That night she heard him through the wall, the quiet kind of crying, the kind children do when trying not to be heard. She lay in her bed and did not go in. In the morning he came down first and stood in the kitchen doorway while she was at the stove. He said, "I didn't mean it." She said, "I know." She put a cup of hot cider on the table for him and went back to the stove. He sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup. She said, without turning, "Your mother." What was she like? He was quiet long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "She smelled like bread." Even when she wasn't baking. Clara said, "That's a good thing to remember." He said nothing, but he stayed at the table until Nora came down, which was longer than he usually did. Thomas watched most of this from doorways and from the corner of his eye. He was a man who had learned to be present without being intrusive, in the way of someone who had spent enough time alone to know its value. He left coffee on the counter in the mornings without mentioning it. He repaired the step off the back porch one Saturday without being asked, and she noticed it that evening for the first time and recognized it had needed doing for weeks. He had seen it too, probably. He had simply gotten to it. This was a pattern she came to understand about him. He did not announce intentions. He saw what needed doing, and he did it, the way he had seen a man dying on the ground and done the arithmetic without deliberating over it. It was the same quality. It operated at different scales. When Nora had a fever that lasted 4 days, he came in from the barn 3 times that day and stood at the bedroom door without entering. On the second day, he brought a second blanket from the cedar chest in the hall and left it on the chair outside the door without knocking. On the 4th day, he came in from the field an hour early. He did not say anything about any of it. Clara managed the fever the way she managed everything, systematically, without drama. The child was better by the 5th morning. He stood in the kitchen doorway that morning and said, "She looks well." Clara said, "She does." She had color in her and was complaining about everything, which is a good sign in children. Something arrived at the corner of his mouth and was gone before it finished. She turned back to the stove. Summer moved through the farm with the quality of useful work. Hay brought in. The garden producing beyond what she had planned. The children sun dark and ranging. James had stopped testing her, not in the way of a child who has given up, but in the way of one who has settled somewhere new and found it holds. He still watched her, But the watching had changed into something more like the attention of a person who has decided to trust a thing and is quietly confirming that the decision was sound. Nora had never stopped trusting her. She trailed Clara through the kitchen and the garden and the yard with the uncomplicated attachment of a child who has found what she was looking for and sees no reason to hide the fact. Clara managed this without fanfare, folding Nora into the work rather than around it. The child shelled beans with the same application she brought to everything, incomplete but earnest, the discards finding their way back into the bowl until Clara moved it out of reach without comment. Nora noticed everything and said most of it aloud. It was Nora who said it. They were at the table on a Tuesday evening in late July, all four of them, the light coming long through the west window, the supper cooling because no one had rushed it. Thomas had said something plain about the north fence and the cost of wire for the season. Clara had given him the figure from the account book without looking up from the plate she was passing. He had taken it and looked at her for a moment with something she had not looked back at directly. Nora had her elbows on the table, her chin in her hands, moving her attention from one to the other with the open interest of a child who does not know she is observing anything. She said, "You look at each other like you live here." No one said anything. Thomas looked at the window. Clara looked at her plate. James looked at Nora with the expression of an older child who has understood what a younger one has said entirely by accident and is working out whether to be embarrassed or relieved. Nora picked up her fork and went back to her supper. She had said the true thing, the way she always said things, plainly, without theater, because it was simply true, and she saw no reason to hold it. The thing that interrupted the arrangement of the summer arrived on a Friday in late August. A man named Garrett Pruitt rode out in the middle of the morning with a copy of the county deed and a tone pitched to Carrie. He had been the one making the most noise in town about Thomas Aldrich. He had made an offer on the north pasture the prior year that Thomas had declined, and the declining had not improved him. He came through the gate without calling ahead and found Clara in the kitchen garden with Nora. He said he was looking for Aldrich. She said he was in the far field and could be fetched. He looked at her with the deliberate quality of a man deciding whether to bother with courtesy and said he would wait on the porch. She went and got Thomas. By the time they came back, Pruitt had arranged himself at the top of the porch steps with the deed papers held in front of him like a deed to the air itself, and James and Nora had been drawn to the bottom step by the presence of someone with something to announce. Clara had not anticipated this and did not like it. The children had no business being in the architecture of whatever Pruitt had come to build, and there was no graceful way to move them without making the moving itself into something. She left them where they were. Pruitt said what he had come to say in the manner of a man who has rehearsed it more than once and arrived at a version he was satisfied with. There was an organized feeling in town, he said, and he used the word organized with the care of a man who wants his audience to understand that he is not alone, that what he represents is larger than himself. Organized feeling that a man who had brought 400 armed warriors to the edge of a community with children and families was not the kind of neighbor a community could remain comfortable with. He said the word community 3 times. He said families twice. He held the deed papers in front of him throughout, not reading from them, simply holding them. The way a man holds a thing he wants the room to be aware of, without quite producing it as evidence. There were those prepared to formalize that discomfort, he said, through proper channels. He said proper channels in the tone of a man who has spent time thinking about where the proper channels run and is fairly confident they run in his direction. He let his voice carry to the fence line and beyond it, to the road, where 2 men had slowed their horses to listen. This was not accidental. The audience on the road was part of the occasion. Pruitt was not only speaking to Thomas, he was speaking to the record, to the version of this afternoon that would be repeated in town before supper, and he was pitching his performance accordingly. James had gone very still on the bottom step, his hands flat on his knees, in the way of a child who has learned that stillness is sometimes the only available dignity. Nora was looking at her boots with the focused attention of a child who does not entirely understand what is happening, but understands enough to know it is not ordinary. Clara stood at the edge of the porch to one side, not in the scene and not outside of it, in the way of a person who understands that a witness is not the same as a bystander. She kept her face neutral and her hands at her sides, and she watched Pruitt with the steady attention of someone filing things away. Thomas listened to all of it with his hat in both hands, turning it once slowly by the brim. When Pruitt finished, he looked at him in the way of a man who has already resolved this conversation in his head and is simply waiting for the actual version to catch up. He said, "I hear you, Garrett." He said it without volume. He said, "A man was dying on the Cedro Creek land while I was running a fence line. He was the chief of his people. He was on the ground and he was dying. I picked him up and carried him 9 miles to shelter and went back for the 2 men who were with him. 3 weeks later, his warriors rode to my fence line. The chief was with them. He looked well. He nodded at me. I nodded back. His people rode away. That is all of it." He put his hat on. He said, "The deed is the deed. The county record shows what I have earned. What you're holding does not change that. What the town decides about me is the town's business. My business is the farm." The 2 men on the road had stopped their horses entirely. Pruitt looked at Thomas and then at the papers in his own hands with the expression of a man recalibrating when the cost turns out to be more real than he had estimated. He said something about community safety, and the carrying quality had gone out of his voice. Thomas said, "I think you know where the gate is." Pruitt stood on the top step for a moment with nowhere useful to go. Then he went through the gate and mounted his horse and rode without hurrying back toward town, which was a performance of its own kind, only reduced. The 2 men on the road watched him go. Then they looked back at Thomas, still standing at the top of his porch, and one of them said something to the other in a low voice, and they rode on. James had not moved. Thomas came down from the porch and sat on the step beside him and was quiet for a moment. The boy was looking at the gate. Thomas said, "You all right?" James said, "He was talking about you like you did something wrong." Thomas said, "He was." James said, "You didn't." Thomas said, "No." They sat there. Thomas said, "Some men talk loudest about the things they wouldn't do themselves." James thought about this. Then he said, "He wouldn't have carried anyone." Thomas said, "No, I don't think he would have." James nodded in the way of a person who has found the explanation that covers the ground, and got up and went to help with the afternoon wood without being asked. Clara had come off the porch. She was at the kitchen garden with her back to the yard, pulling something that did not need pulling. Thomas came to the garden fence and stood there. He said, "I'm sorry you were here for that." She said, without turning, "I'm not." He was quiet. He said, "You knew before you came. The land office man told you." She said, "Before I walked out here." He said, "And you came anyway." She turned and looked at him over the fence. The late afternoon light was on his face, and he did not turn from it. She said, "A man carried a dying stranger 9 miles on his back in the cold, because the arithmetic of it was plain. That told me everything I needed to know about the ground here. Whether it would hold." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that he let stay there for a moment, which was different from how he usually handled things. He said, "Miss Voss." "Clara." He turned his hat in his hands. He said, "The children need a mother. I have the farm and I can keep it. I'm not a man with much in the way of poetry, but I know what this place needs, and I know what you've made of it already. I think you could be content here. I think I could make it so. I'm asking you to stay." Not as the housekeeper. He stopped. He looked at a point somewhere above the barn roofline. He said, "It's a plain offer, but it's honest." She looked at him with the expression of a woman checking the quality of ground before stepping onto it. Then she said, "The carpentry on the east bedroom needs attending before winter." He said, "I know it." she said, "and the grain records want a proper page. What you had before won't satisfy the bank if it comes to that." He said, "All right." She said, "All right then." He looked at her. She said, "Yes, Thomas. That's what all right means." He stood at the fence for a moment, looking at nothing in particular above the barn. He went to hang his hat properly. Autumn arrived with frost on the window glass, and wood smoke settled permanently into the walls. The kitchen garden was put to bed, the last of the root vegetables pulled and stored in the cool dark of the cellar, the beds turned and left to the cold. The grain was in. The farm had the particular stillness of a place that has completed its year's work and knows it. The east bedroom carpentry was finished. Thomas had worked 3 evenings in a row at it, coming in late to a cold supper that Clara left covered on the stove without comment. On the first evening he worked alone. On the second, James stood in the yard outside the window for a while before going back in. On the last evening, he appeared in the doorway with a lantern without being called and held it steady while his father fitted the last panel, the light falling in a clean angle across the work. Neither of them said anything about it. When it was done, Thomas ran his hand along the frame once to check the fit, and James watched his hand, and that was all. Nora moved through the house with the confidence of someone who had never expected it to be otherwise. She had claimed her corner of the kitchen bench, her peg by the door, her place at the table, not by announcement, but by repetition. The way children establish territory through the sheer consistency of occupying it. She left her boots at the door each night in Clara's spot, and Clara put them beside her own without comment. She had done this since the second week, and neither of them had ever addressed it, which meant it was simply how things were now. Clara had settled into the house the way a sound settles into walls, present in everything, not announced in anything. The account book on the shelf, the particular way the morning fire was laid, the order in which the day's work arranged itself, which had shifted over the months from her learning the household shape to the household having taken on some of hers. Thomas noticed this without remarking on it. He noticed most things without remarking on them. There was a Sunday in late October when all 4 of them walked the south pasture in the afternoon, the grass gone to bronze, the sky enormous and pale. Nora was 30 yards ahead, doing the walking of a person covering serious ground. James fell beside Thomas at some point with the easy quiet of someone who has decided where he stands and has stopped rehearsing it. Clara walked between and slightly behind, her hands in her coat pockets, the cold sharp and clean. At the field's edge the grass moved, deer working toward the creek in the early dusk, single file, unhurried. Nora stopped and pointed and held her breath and said, barely above a whisper, "Look." She said it in the way children say things they want to keep happening. They all went still and watched until the last one had slipped into the shadow of the trees and the grass was quiet again behind them. Nora lowered her arm. She reached back without looking and found Clara's hand. They walked back to the house. The fire was already lit in the morning. Thomas lit it, and the room came up warm by the time supper was on the table. James set the places without being asked. Nora argued about her chair, and then sat in the same chair she always sat in, which was the chair she had argued herself into the first week and claimed without further contest. Outside the dark had settled completely, and the window glass held the lamp's reflection, and the 4 of them moving inside it, around each other, with the ordinary unhurried grace of people who have learned the shape of the same rooms. The smell of supper was in the walls. The fire was talking quietly to itself in the grate. The east bedroom door hung plumb in its repaired frame. There was nothing waiting in the house anymore. If a story like this one has stayed with you, leave it in the comments below.